Hi guys, David here with Cascade Components. Today we're going to be installing our Stumpjumper link on the 2021 Stumpjumper EVO. Alright, so the tools that you'll need are a 6mm Allen wrench, a 5mm Allen wrench, a 4mm Allen wrench. You'll need a torque wrench with 6 and 5mm Allen wrench bits. You'll need a shock pump, some blue Loctite, and some grease. Alright, so the first step in installing your link is to get the back wheel out of the way. So we'll take this off, set it to the side. Alright, now that the back wheel's out of your way, you want to go through and loosen all the bolts we're going to take off. So we're going to be loosening these 3 bolts on this side, the matching bolts on the other side, as well as the shock mount bolt at the top of the shock. The link can be put in with the shock still in place, but just to remove a few more things that can scratch your paint, we're going to remove the shock and shock yoke entirely. So to do that, we'll fully remove the bolts on the yoke. All right, once you have both bolts out, you get ready to take out the last one. Make sure you're holding the seat stays, and then you can let these come down slowly. So right there, you can pull the yoke the remainder of the way up. Set the bolts aside, and we'll remove the shock by removing this upper bolt. You can set the shock and yoke aside. Right, now that your shock is out of the way, we're going to remove the seat stays from the yoke. And once all your bolts are out, make sure you're hanging on to everything. And you can move the yoke up and out of the seat stays. And we'll set all the hardware to the side. Now the final step in removing the stock link from the bike is to remove these front pivots here. These pivots do have spacers that will fall out when you remove the link. So once your first bolt is out, you can use one hand to cover that other side. Okay. Now once you have both bolts removed, you want to keep your fingers around the link, and then you can use them to pinch the 2 spacers in place. Alright, now that you have the link removed from your bike, we're going to remove the bearing spacers. Now these are held in place as they press fit into the bearings themselves. They can be a little tricky to remove. You could use pliers if you wanted to, or I prefer using my 4mm Allen wrench. Right down in between the 2 bearing spacers, there's a small gap that you can usually fit a wrench into to push them out. So do that now. They're a pretty snug fit, so you'll have to do one side and then work to the other side. And they'll eventually pop right out. All 8 of them are the same, so we can just remove all of them and put them in a pile. All right, now that we have all the bearing spacers out, we can take the stock link and set it aside. Now that the stock link is out of the way, we want to go through our hardware and we can clean off all the old grease. So the main pivot bolts on the Stumpjumper, you'll notice, have this little rubber seal. Sometimes it can come off, so when you're getting ready to get everything reinstalled, you want to make sure that that's in the groove there that holds it, and that it's flush and in a straight line all the way around. So now that everything is clean and we have the rubber seals reset into these bolts, we're going to go through and add a thin layer of grease on everything that's going to touch the bearings. So on these, you just want to put a little dab of grease there, and then you can use your finger to spread it around evenly. So we'll go through and we'll get all of our hardware greased and start the install process. All right, now once we have all 8 bearing spacers greased, what we're going to do is start installing them in the link. They go in the back 2 pivot locations, so we'll start reinstalling them there. Again, they're all the same, so it doesn't matter which exact spot they came out of. It just matters that they go in the back 2 bearings. They can be kind of a snug fit, so just make sure they all go together smoothly. All right. Now once we have all the bearing spacers in, we're going to take the bearing spacers for the front 2 bearings, and we're going to apply a little dab of grease on the narrow side. You'll notice that these bearing spacers have a wider side here and a narrower side up here. The narrow side faces the bearings themselves on the link, and the wider side here contacts the frame. Putting the grease on the narrow side here can help the bearing spacer stick to the bearing, and that'll make the install process easier. All right, now that we have our spacers installed, we can put a little grease on the bolts. Specialized says that any surface that contacts the bearing should be greased. So on these bolts, we'll put a little bit of grease here. Specialized also recommends using some blue Loctite on the threads, which we would normally do. For demonstration purposes for this video, we're not going to, but on your personal bike, put a dab of blue Loctite here and grease on this part of the bolt. We'll use our finger to spread it out. Do that to both bolts, and then we'll start installing the link on the bike. All right, so now comes the good part. We get to start installing the link on our bike. So as you can see, these 2 front bearing spacers are being held on by the grease. It's still not a bad idea to use your hands to make sure that they don't go anywhere, but we're going to start by sliding the link back over the frame and get that in place. And we can start threading in these main pivot bolts here. So for now, we're just going to get these bolts snugged down. We'll come back at the end of the process and get everything torqued down to spec. Now that we have the front pivot bolts installed and tightened, what we're going to do is we're going to get the seat stay pivots installed. The seat stay just slides right over the link, and we can get our hardware pushed through. There's these small bolts here. There's 4 of these, 1 on each seat stay pivot and 1 on each yoke pivot. All 4 are the same, so it doesn't matter which 2 bolts you grab, just grab 2 of them. Again, just like the main pivot bolts, feel free to put a drop of blue Loctite on the threads of these bolts as well. And we'll get these bolts snugged up. Again, we'll torque these later at the end of the process. So now comes time to put the shock and the shock yoke back on the bike. So be careful about scratches here. We'll fish this through. We'll get our upper shock mount bolt started first. And we'll just run this down. And we'll come back to the middle pivot, the shock yoke, where it attaches to the link. And it just works its way on there. Get everything lined up, and you can start putting in your pivot hardware. with everything else, get it snugged up. We'll come back and torque it later. All right, so now that all of the bolts are back in place and snugged up, we're going to go through with our torque wrench and torque everything down. Torque specs can be found on the Specialized Service Center website or as part of our website in the service section. You can use a 4mm Allen wrench to back up the bolt, get your torque wrench, and begin torquing to spec. Doesn't matter which order you go in, just make sure that everything gets torqued up properly. All right, now that we have all the bolts torqued down, we're going to go ahead and put our wheel back in the bike. Now that we've got the wheel back on and the bike on the ground, what we need to do is double check for clearances everywhere. To do that, we're going to let all the air out of this shock. If you have a coil shock, you're going to want to remove the spring, but you'll want to leave the bottom out bumper and the lower spring retainer in place. All right, so now that we have all the air out of the shock, what we're going to do is compress the suspension by hand. Closely watch everything and make sure there's adequate clearance everywhere. The bike is now at full bottom out. And you want to look back here at the seat stay bridge. Make sure you have a few millimeters of clearance here. Also, just verify there's clearance around the link. And we're good to go. The next step now is to connect your shock pump, air your shock back up, or reinstall your spring, and then get your sag set to 30%. All right, so that wraps up the install process of the Cascade Components link on the 2021 Stumpjumper EVO. If you have any questions about this or any of the other products that we make, feel free to check us out on our website at cascadecomponents.bike.